Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. We welcome to Online Teaching Academy Ekalaiva, Standard 11 Subject Biology. In the last class we have studied about the flower and its 4 whorls. Now we quickly look into the textbook, children. Now the flower is a reproductive unit in the angiosperms and it is meant for sexual reproduction. And it has arisen on a thalamus or receptacle, and we said there are 4 whorls are there: calyx, corolla, androecium and gynecium. And in this, calyx and corolla are what we call it them as accessory organs, we will call it as non-essential parts or accessory organs, while androecium and gynecium are the reproductive organs. And we also said that if both androecium and gynecium are present, you call it as bisexual. If a flower is having only either a stamen, you call stamen, or carpel, you call it as unisexual. If only stamen is present, you call it as staminate, and if it is only pistil is there, either you call it as pistillate or carpellate flower, you will call it as. And when we are talking about the symmetry, we said that the flower may be actinomorphic, that is the radial symmetry. You can cut the flower into equal halves at many planes, or it may be the zygomorphic, which is bilateral symmetry. Only at one angle you can cut the flower into 2 equal halves. So either it may be actinomorphic or zygomorphic. If you cannot divide the flower into 2 equal halves at any plane, you call it as asymmetric, you will call it as. And depending upon how many number of floral appendages are present, a flower may be trimerous, that is 3 or multiples of 3, and it is the characteristic feature of monocots. Tetramerous or pentamerous, 4 multiples of 4 or 5 multiples of 5, which you can see in dicots. And a flower may have a bract. What is a bract? Bract is nothing but a reduced leaf which is found at the base of the pedicel. You call it as bract. And if a flower is having a bract, you call it as a bracteate. And if it doesn't have a bract, you call it as abracteate. Ebracteate you will call it as. Now, based on the position of the calyx and corolla, in respect of the ovary on thalamus, we have 3 different forms are there. What you call them as hypogynous, perigynous and epigynous. So in this picture you can see here, that is the ovary here, you can see this is the ovary which is there. The ovary is above and all the floral appendages are below. So you can see that this is the sepal, and this is the petal which you can see, and the androecium which is there. All these floral appendages are below the ovary and the ovary is above. So you call this kind of position of ovary on the thalamus, what you call it as hypogynous, you call it as. And if the ovary is below, and this is the ovary which is below, and the floral appendages, that is this is the calyx and this is the corolla, the androecium, if they are above, then you call this as epigynous, you will call it as. And if the floral appendages are there in between the position of the ovary, then you call it as perigynous, you will call it as, which you call it as half inferior, you will call it as. So here you can see that in the hypogynous flower, the gynecium occupies the highest position. This is the gynecium which is occupying the highest position, while all the other parts are situated below it. Then you call that ovary as superior. The ovary is superior to the other floral appendages. So you call it as a superior ovary, you will call it as, or you call it as hypogynous. Example, mustard, China rose and brinjal. If Gynecium is situated, this is the Gynecium, the Gynecium is situated in the center and all the other parts of the flower are located on the rim of the thalamus almost at the same level, then you call it as perigynous, you will call it as. Otherwise, we call that as half inferior, which you can see in plum rose. And in epigynous flower, this is the epigynous flower, where the margin of the thalamus grows upward, enclosing the ovum completely and fused with it, and all the other parts of the flower arise above the ovary. So here you can see that this is the ovary. Above the ovary you can see all the floral parts are arising. Then you call that kind of ovary as epigynous, or you will say that the ovary is said to be inferior, and you will find in guava and cucumber and the florets of sunflower. So based on the position of the ovary on the thalamus, we have hypogynous, superior ovary, this is half inferior, and this is what we call it as inferior ovary when all the other floral appendages are above and the gynecium is below. And we said that these are the floral parts, and either if they are free, you call it as polypetalous. If they are fused, you call it as gamopetalous. Now, we were saying that the calyx and corolla are arranged in a definite pattern, and the arrangement of the calyx and corolla in the bud condition, we call it as estivation. We call that as estivation, we will call it as. What is estivation? Estivation is nothing but the mode of arrangement of sepals on petals in the floral bud with respect to the other members of the same whorl is known as estivation. And here there are four major types of estivation or arrangement of sepals and petals are there. We will see this here. You can see that it is valvate estivation. In this valvate estivation, you can see these ends will not overlap with each other, they are free. So you call that kind of arrangement of calyx and corolla as valvate estivation. So you can see that these margins are free, they don't overlap with each other. And the other kind of estivation, you call it as twisted estivation, you will call it as. Here you can see that this end is free and this is overlapping with the next one. And here you can find that this is free, this is overlapping with this. This is free, this is overlapping. So this kind of arrangement is what we call it as twisted estivation, you will call it as. And the third kind Now, when we talk about the anther types, if the anther, the microsporangia, if it is having only one lobe with two microsporangia, then we call that as monothecous. You will find in hibiscus, where you will find this is the monothecous type. So, they are kidney shaped in cross section, mostly we will see in Malvaceae. Dithecous is two. If you find two like this, then you call it as dithecous, or normally we will draw like this. So, this is monothecous, this is dithecous. Now, when you talk about, so you can see that this is the monothecous one, this is the dithecous. Here you will find 2, here you will find 4. And depending upon the dehiscence of anther, we have either longitudinal, transverse forms we will talk about. Mostly we will talk about these two, that if the anthers dehisce along a suture parallel to the long axis of each anther lobe, you call it as longitudinal. If it is transverse, they dehisce at right angles to the long axis of the anther lobe, which we will find in Malvaceae. And then when you talk about the attachment of the anthers, we have 4 different types are there. One we call it as basifixed, that is, if the base of the anther is being attached to the tip of the filament, then you call it as basifixed. And if, like you talk about this, if it is attached here at the base, it is basifixed. If it is attached at the dorsal side, you call it as dorsifixed. If it is attached to the dorsal side of the anther, example you will find in citrus and hibiscus. If the filament is attached to the anther at the midpoint, like if you say that at the midpoint here, then you call it as versatile, which most commonly we will see in grasses. And if the filament is continued from the base, like if you say that this is the base and this is the filament, this is the anther, you can find that it is here till here. If it is attached from the base to the apex of the anther, then you call it as adnate. So, based on the attachment here, either it may be basifixed at the base, dorsal side dorsifixed. If they attach the anther at the midpoint, like the seesaw, you call it as the versatile, and if it is attached from the base to the apex of the anther, you call it as adnate. So, here you can see this, and depending upon the dehiscing direction, you say that 2 terms we are going to see. One we call it as introse and the other one is extrose. What is introse? If the anther, now you all know that the purpose of the anther is it has to split and it has to distribute the pollen grains. If the anther dehisces towards the center of the flower, then you call that kind of dehiscence as introse, you will call it as. We call that as introse. So, anther, if it dehisces towards the center of the flower, you call it as introse. If the anther is dehiscing towards the periphery of the flower, then you call that as extrose. So, internally towards the center, introse, towards the periphery, you call it as extrose. In the next class, we will study about Gynesium, the innermost whorl of the flower. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha.